president of Friends of Chamber Music, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's performance in context. We are so lucky to have the Dover String Quartet with us. You may have seen their film, the documentary about them called Strings Attached. We showed it at the Linda, but you may have seen it elsewhere, or maybe through the link on our website. They will be playing a concert this Saturday at 7:30 at Page Hall. Tickets are available at the door for $35, or you can purchase them on our website. They'll be held for you at will call. We'll be playing a program that includes Zemlinsky's Quartet No. 1 in A major, Opus 4, Pulitzer Prize winning composer Tanya Leon's Quartetto No. 2 for string quartet, and Brahms Quartet in A minor, Opus 51 No. 2. The Dover Quartet have been amongst the most sought-after string quartets since winning every single one of the special prizes and the grand prize at the 2013 dance competition. I watched it over live stream from Abu Dhabi breathlessly, and I'm so happy that I get to host them here. They've had many honors bestowed upon them, including an Avery Fisher Career Grant, Chamber Music America's Cleveland Quartet Award, and Lincoln Center's Hunt Family Award. They currently serve as the inaugural Penelope P. Watkins Ensemble in Residence at the Curtis Institute of Music, which is a unique position that offers them a chance to perform and work with young ensembles while maintaining a recording career, and we'll want to hear some about that. They've recently released the second of 3 volumes of Beethoven's full string quartets. So I'd like to welcome the Dover Quartet, Joel Link, violin, maybe you wave when I say your name, Brian Lee, violin, Milena Pajaro Bendestat, viola, and Camden Shah, cello. So welcome, you guys. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So for those of you who are listening, we have an interview, and then toward the end, you'll have a chance to ask questions in person if you like. You're free to type questions into the chat box, and I keep an eye on the chat box, and I will insert your questions into our conversation as we go. If I don't do it right away, it's because I know that there's a place later in the conversation where it'll fit in perfectly. So we're going to start with early memories. Everyone wants to know how someone becomes a classical musician. How they choose what instrument that they're going to play. And so I'm going to ask you all to tell us something about your earliest musical memory.
Should we just go in score order?
Yeah, go in score order. That's a good idea.
Earliest musical memory. Are we starting from the top of the score order or the bottom of the score?
We'll go from the top.
Okay. Well, I'm the youngest of 3. I think my first musical memory was that my siblings had started, and I remember being at my sister's Twinkle recital when she was very, very young. And apparently I yelled that it was my turn to play when I did not know how to play. So that is one of my earliest musical memories. Not one I'm particularly proud of, but it happened.
Yeah, my first musical memory, I think, is of my first public performance. It was, I had my first teacher. He always hosted these sort of like studio classes, and so I remember just running up on stage and being so excited to perform, and then immediately almost forgetting to bow at the end of the piece, and then just immediately like running off stage. I think I was probably about 7 or so. So yeah, that was probably my first musical memory.
I forgot I was next. Okay. So my first musical memory, it must have been my dad. He plays piano. He's a doctor. But he gave me my first music lessons. Like, he tried to teach me piano, and I was very stubborn about it and decided that, fine, I'll play a musical instrument, but it can't be something that you can teach me. So my parents let me pick another instrument, and that's when I picked violin. I was living in England at the time, and I started violin at a Suzuki school in Oxford. Another early memory I have is my teacher, my Suzuki violin teacher, having me name each of the strings on the violin after one of my classmates. So I had like Emily and Alice and David, and just people who I knew from my class who I could remember what the different notes were on the instrument.
That's cute.
That actually kind of reminds me of, well, my earliest memories really with music had to do with my dad because he was actually a conductor. They were mostly of him studying, listening to music a lot, and just, it was sort of always on in the house. But to be honest, that just reminded me of my first memory of cello, which I don't even think you guys in the quartet, was my first cello lesson. I still remember it. And the teacher had these stickers that I think were for like if you have corns on your skin or something, so they have a hole in the middle so that you could, comfortably find somewhere with your fingertip and kind of really be in the right place. And man, she put those things on everything. There was one where your left-hand thumb went, where every finger went, on the string at first because she was trying to get this to. And what I remember was being in the car afterward, and my parents were like, "So, what do you think of the cello?" And I remember thinking like, well, seems like it's really mostly about just getting the stickers in the right place and getting a lot of stickers. I feel like I could do that. So I remember thinking it was very simple at the beginning. How wrong I was.
You were very, very wrong. That's really funny. So I want to ask you if you would tell something about the instrument, the actual instrument that you play on. Whatever you want to tell us about it, how you acquired it, is it old or new, how you chose it, what you like about it versus others of the same, size and so forth. And we can go backwards this time because I already have you in the center of my screen, Camden.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'm very lucky to be borrowing a Josephilius Guarneri cello. It's on loan to me through the J&A Beer violin shop in London. And that shop actually has a relationship with our quartet in general, where they've been very helpful in trying to line us up with very old, interesting instruments if we so choose to. But it can be tricky because these older instruments usually, if there's a spectrum of instruments on the spectrum of an instrument being a tool, which is something actually, for instance, David Finkel in the Emerson Quartet has described an instrument as being a tool, where you kind of want it to be able to do whatever you want it to do. And then if you think of an instrument also as having its own personality, where it kind of it has an immense amount of richness and complexity on its own, older instruments tend to be much farther toward that other side of the spectrum, where they're very have complexity built in, but maybe are a little bit harder to manipulate. So I'd say this cello is very far on that side, where it has a lot of character and a lot of opinions about things already, which is very cool. It's very different from some of the cellos I've played in the past. I've usually played modern instruments. But I love the richness and complexity in the sound, and I love actually the way, especially that the lower strings feel under the bow, because they really make you work, but it makes you very aware of the feeling of the strings under your arm, and I do really like that. It's kind of like sort of plowing through very fertile soil, and there's an appealing, notion to that. So I enjoy that.
Oh, that's interesting. The plowing through the soil is a good image. So there's a lot of feedback between the instrument and the player. You don't just, yeah. And I like that description a lot.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
So I had been trying a lot of different instruments over the last few years. Before then, the instrument that I own outright is a modern instrument by Gabriel Kundert. That's a copy of the Primrose Mighty, and I played that for many years. It was actually made for one of my teachers, Roberto Diaz, who was the president of Curtis. And then I was lucky enough to be loaned a very well-known instrument, the decane, that was played on by Boris Kreut when he was in the Budapest Quartet. Mm-hmm. And I played on that for a few years, and it was so drastically different from my modern instrument, which had a very clear immediacy of sound very open under my ear, a little bit shorter, very easy to play, but certain notes are super finicky on it, much like the actual Amati after which it's designed. But the decane had certain qualities that you can't really get in a brand new instrument. even though 2004 isn't technically brand new, still pretty darn new. And that gave me the opportunity to explore some other color palettes and things like that. After which I started to really think I should search for an instrument of my own that has some of these more complicated, finer qualities. And Roberto, again, happened to be in Boston, and he knew that the now retired principal of viola of the Boston Symphony, Burton Fine, was looking to sell his viola. So Roberto tried it out and thought, I think Milena might be interested in this, and he drove it to Philly, and I never gave it back. I ended up buying that, or I'm in the process of buying it, because it wasn't an instrument that I could just buy on the spot. So in about a decade and a half, I will finally own this thing. But I completely fell in love with it. It was really interesting because at first, once again, violas also, I think, tend to be just in terms of like the sheer variety of shape and size of the instrument. They sound so drastically different, one viola to the next. They feel very different to play. So when I first started playing on it, it felt, again, like a new, completely foreign instrument. But the more I played on it, the more I felt that it incorporated all the quality. It had certain qualities that my modern instrument has. It has certain like really fine coloristic qualities that the Decanet and other fine old Italian instruments have. And then it also has like I think it has a very warm, deep, rich sound that I fell in love with. And I felt like the more I played it, the more I was finding my own voice. And it felt like I'd found myself within that instrument. So I was just convinced and haven't looked back. But they actually don't know who made it. It's an early 18th century Italian instrument. There's been some speculation, and like decades ago they thought it was like a sparticello, but that has since been, I guess, debunked or changed. So we don't know. It's a mystery viola.
So somebody asked a good question to ask now. They wondered if, when you play an old instrument like this, it has been played by great players, other players, do you somehow feel a connection with the people who played it before you?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, well, I'm assuming that question came because of the Budapest Quartet viola that I was playing before. Yeah, absolutely. You hear it in the sound, and I left out a viola that I'd played on for about 6 months 2 years ago, which was the Busan that Michael Tree, one of my teachers, used to play on. Mm-hmm. And that was that was the prime example of that for me. It was every time I played on the A string, I felt like I was just hearing my teacher play under my ear because the sound was so recognizable. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. But then you start to, all of us are playing instruments or have at least at some point played instruments that were played on by other people. And the longer you play on the instrument, the more it kind of starts to exhibit your own qualities in its sound and in its colors and stuff. So every player kind of leaves their mark on the instrument, and the instrument keeps on developing and changing.
Like inhabiting an old house.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that...
Go ahead.
You're on. It's your turn.
Okay. So my violin is, I've been playing on it for less than a year, actually. It's a modern instrument made by Sam Zygmuntovich, and he's based out of Brooklyn, New York. I think he's probably considered one of the top makers alive today. I waited about 6 years for this instrument to be made, so it was a very long time, but I think it was definitely worth it. It's funny when you're commissioning instruments that you don't really get to choose it necessarily. You just kind of, I feel like there's a nice way that you can mold the sound to your to match sort of your personality, and I feel like the sound is still being shaped, but I'm liking it every day more and more. So
yeah, similarly to Camden, we've forged a relationship with Jane Abier, the shop in London, and they're working with the whole quartet, but they found a sponsor for an instrument that I kind of fell in love with on one of our trips to England. So I'm currently playing on a Peter Guarneri of Mantua from 1710, which actually I think in its history I've learned a couple things about this maker. One is that Henry Shearing would only play on his violins. So that was one really cool thing. And apparently he had many, many different ones throughout his career. The other one, well, I mean, he obviously didn't make very many instruments. And then I think the other thing that's really interesting about him as a maker is that he was kind of known for being probably the most, I guess, exact craftsman of the entire Guarneri family, even more so than Del Gesù. So in terms of looking at it, it's pretty spectacular. And interestingly about this instrument is it belonged to the bow guy Bernard Millon, who lived in Paris for many years and was very, very famous. His professional pictures, him surrounded by like 15 bows in different angles in his shot. It's actually very, very odd, but it didn't really, I don't believe that this particular violin belonged to any famous violinist of note. So in terms of that connection of feeling like, oh, you're playing Henrik Shearing's old instrument, that's not this one, but it is a really special voice, and I love that for me, it seems to have a lot of both darkness and richness, but also that kind of bright quality that I know a lot of people love about Italian instruments, myself included. So it's kind of got a little bit of everything, and I'm still getting to know it as well. So very complex.
So I'm going to go on to the next question. Next most asked question by people is, what does it feel like to perform, to play music? For those who don't play music professionally, this is a mystery. You know, you watch this lovely thing happen and you feel it yourself and you wonder how it feels to be the people producing it. And we'll start with you, Joel, since you're already up.
Sure. I feel like my relationship with performance has changed so much over the years. Mm-hmm. I would say that I learn a lot about myself in performance, and the very cool thing about getting to perform as much as we've had the opportunity to is that a concert is not really a destination, it's part of the process. And I think that in growing up and going to school, it was always kind of the feeling like you have this one moment to play your Brahms sonata, right? And then you've been working all semester, even sometimes like all year, and there's so much kind of built into what this performance means and how you expect it to go and all this expectation. Not to say that you lower that over a career of much performance, but you see that it's not just about that you're a much greater player than what happens in one night, whether really, really positive or really negative from, a professional, I guess, experience. So I would say, though, that the moments that I can get outside of myself and really just think about the connection with people, which I feel like gets easier and easier with time, I think that's when it's really, really amazing, is when you feel like you're just telling someone a very intimate story, and that you get to, and that's, of course, one of my things that I love playing in quartet is that you get the opportunity to be able to intimately say something to people where your voice is very unique and individual, but then you're also part of something much greater than yourself.
So you feel a connection with the audience, and yeah.
I think that's a huge thing for sure, is like really just feeling like you can tell when the audience is there with you too. It's like the audience plays a part in that relationship. I think a lot more than, I mean, I've always thought it, but especially over the pandemic and just over a lot of chances to get to perform, you just do notice that when you can play in a way that feels very similarly one night to another night, but just depending on the people that are there and how they're experiencing it. And of course, it draws something extra out of you.
Mm-hmm. This question actually reminds me of something that we say to our students a lot, which is that as performers, we can basically just think of ourselves as the luckiest members of the audience, because ideally we're going to be experiencing the music in real time at the same time. So in a way, we're all just in it together, and that's what makes it feel so gratifying when you have the audience there. You're experiencing the music at the same time as the audience. You just happen to be kind of touching it at the same time, and you are the one like creating the sounds. But I think that's the really fun, for me, that's like really satisfying, fun part of it, is to have it be like, because music, when we're kids, when we're just starting to learn, it's a very personal thing. It's very like just completely, how does it feel, like the tactile thing, and then why do you like to do it, that it's music. And then the more and more you start to perform, it just like opens up into a completely different animal. And it just feels like a vessel for experiencing things together, especially when you have like an audience, like Joel was saying, that's just right there with you.
And you're communicating and responding to each other at the same time, like which is what draws many people to watching in particular chamber music. They're watching the interplay of the various players. And so I wonder if you could describe exactly how you're doing that. What
Exactly.
or in general terms, how you're doing that. What are you looking for? What are you listening for?
Well, so I think it's always different, and we might have different answers from one another, but I think that especially having played together for so long, that process has developed and changed. Like when we first started playing together as a group, and similarly when we play with people, that collaborate with people who we never play with pretty much or don't play with regularly, we're hyper aware visually of what is happening and trying to read people's body language and look at the mechanism of like how they're playing their instrument to figure out how we can follow, like best be together or connect with one another. But being in a quartet like this, where we've been together for 13 years, we don't really have to look around so much as we listen and kind of intuitively feel. So we're basically just like trying to, it's kind of metaphysical. It feels like you can just feel the energy between the people without having to look because we know each other so well musically. So yeah, it's kind of hard to just specifically say what the exact thing is that we're doing, but if we're focused and in the moment, it works.
So there's an exercise that string quartets often do where you sit with your backs to each other and you play without seeing each other, and then you're having to listen only. I'm sure you've done this. Yeah.
Oh
Yeah. Actually, you're reminding me of a funny story, and I won't even say what city this was in, but we played in a city on Earth, and after the concert, this one audience member was noticing that we don't look at each other a ton, at least not very obviously. We're not like, making a big show of it. And so they said, is that just kind of where you're at right now? Like you're not really ready. Her, implication was that we weren't ready to look at each other. And, we sort of were amused and we're like, yeah, actually, yeah, it's, we're listening. That is where we're at right now. So it was very funny. But yeah, sometimes there's that thought that we're going to be like, staring into each other's eyes the whole time, which is not, I think it kind of goes back to what Milena was saying about the concert performance being also a listening experience for us so much. That we're sort of lost in thought sometimes, especially when the music is really good. And so even though your body can be quite busy, there's also a lot of just sort of experiencing and listening and feeling. And in that sense, your eyes can kind of sometimes go to very focused things, like, to make sure things are organized, and sometimes kind of just go wherever makes you most at rest in your mind as well.
Are you in a place when you're performing where you can anticipate things like, and then here comes the great viola solo, and you're right there anticipating Milena coming in, and it can't. Do you feel that or think that ever? Or
honestly, yeah. For me, I feel like the way to make anything sound really great. This is like a thought I've been having these days. In order to do, sure, let's talk about the viola solo. In order for the viola solo to sound good, you have to set it up right? It's not just about what the viola solo is. It's about how you lead into something and how it connects to the next thing. And I think that for me, that's like, I feel like oftentimes I'm like, oh, she's about to have this huge solo. I want to make sure that it's set up in the way that is just like perfect. You know what I mean? And that I feel like is what I'm like really focused on in a lot of ways these days.
You're going to dish it up.
It's like an offering or something that's just like right at the place where she can just kind of like grab it exactly where she wants and then just kind of take off with it, right?
Mm-hmm. Sometimes it feels for me as an observer like everyone has gone under a spell. And I totally love it when that happens. So the next question is, do you have favorite composers or pieces? And I'm talking in particular about quartet pieces by living composers or otherwise, and they've probably changed. Probably you have one that you're really in love with right now. Maybe there was one that you really loved before.
Yeah, I mean, it's always that we have so many favorites, but I'm sure most likely this person wants to hear some names, which I totally understand. At least I would want to hear a couple of specific ones. One that I have to credit Milena with, actually, for exposing all of us is Zemlinsky's second quartet. We're actually playing his first quartet a lot this season, which is a wonderful piece as well. But in terms of Desert Island Pieces, actually, his second quartet is one of those for me, and has sort of in the background since we learned it, since we played it, remained one of my favorite pieces ever. It's so incredible. I guess for me, then a couple other in that similar vein would be Schoenberg's Verklärte Nacht, and a lot of Beethoven for me, especially late Beethoven.
Mm.
Well, he did at least. At least you said my name before you said the piece. But I'm going to totally echo what Cannon said about Sedlinski too. That's one of my absolute favorite quartets. Schoenberg first quartet as well. In terms of I also want to say in the same vein, Alban Berg Opus 3, which is the first piece we ever played together, is one of my all-time favorite pieces. I think I'm just betraying my affinity for that kind of hyper-romantic, bordering on Second Viennese style of quartet writing. But in terms of living composers, actually a really close friend of ours, Chris Rogerson, just wrote this massive, amazing piano quintet that we premiered in Santa Fe. And it is just, I just really hope people will latch onto it and just like give it the fame that it deserves. It is an amazing piece. It's really just like epic experience that's all based around like dream sequences. And he wrote it during the pandemic, where he said he was having, probably very similarly to a lot of other people, really especially vivid dreams. And so he wrote this, I remember how many movements, 5 movements? Yeah, something, it's quite large scale and just beautiful and intense. It has nightmare movements and like really peaceful dream movements. Anyway, Chris Rogerson.
Oh, we'll have to look that up.
Yeah, I think I'd also credit Milena with introducing all of us to Schoenberg 1, because that's become my most recent favorite quartet. But if I had to choose an all-time favorite, sort of, I'd probably go with Schubert Cello Quintet. I know that's not exclusively just quartet, but it's just such an incredible piece of music that I don't think I'll ever get tired of listening to it or playing it. And playing it is a whole different experience as well. It's like so exhausting and exhilarating and terrifying to play, but it's just incredible. So
I'm going to veer off our track a little bit because someone asked a question I should have brought up before. How much role did you have in defining what your instrument was? You know, when you were working with Zygmunt Tovich, did you tell him what you wanted sound-wise? Did you try it out? Did you make adjustments? How much did you get to work with him?
Yeah, so I gave him a lot of input. Basically, you can have it look however you'd like, cosmetically or aesthetically. But in terms of how it sounds, it's always sort of up in the air. You don't really know how it's actually going to turn out in the end. But yeah, so when he was actually finished with the violin, I went to meet him, played on it, and he actually didn't adjust it then. Usually he wants you to sort of play it in a little bit for maybe a few months and then come back if you're unhappy with something. But I played on it for a few months and I didn't really feel like I needed to get anything adjusted. And the sound was just constantly developing. So, but yeah, you never really know how an instrument's going to turn out in the end. But with Sam, it's sort of a sure bet. So.
Yeah, I would think so. Now, getting back to the music that you like, and I want to ask you some questions about your sound in particular. I mean, no two-string quartets sound alike, but the Dover are particularly individual. And I'm just wondering what it is you are listening for or seeking to find as an ensemble in your sound. So I know you play works by living composers and past composers. What is it that stays the same from one to the other that you are constantly seeking?
Ooh, there's a lot in there. In terms of our sound and what we strive for, I would say my guess, it's not like I think we all idolized some certain quartets growing up. I know one of ours as a group, of course, was the Guarneri Quartet, with whom we worked, and also I think grew up listening to pretty much all of their recordings. And I think having that similar idea in our heads or in our ears about like what we thought a string quartet could sound like, I think was very influential. Of course, we don't sound exactly like them, and it's a sad shame because I adore them. I adore them tremendously. We wouldn't want to you wouldn't want to have the exact same sound as someone else also. So I think it was definitely influential. And I think that, we've talked about it a lot, but, when we got together as a quartet, you get 4 individuals who, have a lot to say individually, but you're trying to kind of harness them and turn them into a unit, right? And then after a while, you learn how to vibrate very similarly and to move your bows very similarly. And then you get to this point where as a quartet, you're great, but then you maybe lost some of your individuality. So I think, it's a constant balance of finding the blend when you need it and the individuality when you need it. And I think we're, if one is going in one direction at any one time, I feel like now we're in the direction of making sure that we sound individual and have our own voices individually, which I think is good because, like Milena was saying, so many of the, we've been together for so long, and so many of that stuff is just kind of, we hear it and make those little changes all the time to be unified about things. And of course, someone might be like, hey, the end of this note is really not together, or like this is not quite where it needs to be. And of course, we overlook things, but I think that striving for that individual artistic excellence is for me, it's a point of pride and something that I think we all really get a lot out of ourselves in terms of sound. One of you guys wants to keep answering because there's more, I think, in Jennifer's question. But you were asking about, was there about?
Yeah. Well, what stays the same and what differs when you go from one piece to another? Yeah. For instance, this is what made me ask this question. I always go to the fish-off competition every year that they have it, and I watch all the strings and I watch all the wins. And the younger players, because they're like 18-year-olds, they're all stirring the pot the same direction. Their bows are exactly right. Everything is exactly synchronized. And the older players are not as synchronized. They're much more like what you're describing. So they're after something entirely different and something more personal.
Well, what you're describing with the group mechanism and how the younger groups seem to be completely like choreographed together and unified in every way. The analogy I would make is to learning an instrument itself. That when you're first learning an instrument, it's all about the fundamentals. It's all about having your fingers go in the right place, being in tune, being in rhythm and all that stuff. And then the more in control of that you are, then the more freedom you have as a result. And I think with a young group, it's a very similar thing. Young group, it's very important that they line everything up and that they figure out how to play together and how to be in tune with one another. So if they're doing that, they're probably starting out the group in a healthy way, even though they do sound younger or they do look very different from how an older group would play it. But then once you kind of have that solid foundation, which I think is also what Joel was kind of getting at with us, you can kind of just break out of that, trust that it's there, and have a lot more freedom.
Mm-hmm. So if you could describe your sound as a group, how would you describe it?
Normal to us.
Normal. Okay.
No, I don't know. Well, I do think that we all, one unifying factor perhaps is that we all value a really lush type of vibrato. And our left-hand styles, in terms of the shaping of the vibrato, and also hopefully with having a lot of variety in our vibratos, there's a certain analogous relationship to each instrument. So of course it's going to get slower as you go down, from violin to cello. But in relation to the instruments themselves, I think there is something that's really quite in common there with our sounds, and I do think that's perhaps something special. I wanted to add one thought though too. When we're sort of exploring this as groups get older and maybe they're less concerned with things being exactly together. One thing that's been inspiring me lately is listening to great pianists. I actually didn't listen to pianists that much most of my musical life, to be honest. And I think the way that the really great ones explore timing is so interesting because it reminds me of like watching a dancer and how the different lines, the different musical parts are almost like different parts of a dancer's body. And if they set up a phrase with enough momentum, the body's going to spread out or contract or be vertical or horizontal depending on the momentum of the different parts. And I think the great musicians kind of have an understanding of these momentums. And so things are really not just vertical and really neatly packaged all the time, but sometimes the line will force the top note to be very late or very early, for instance, and it's all kind of part of this beautiful flow. It can also be an excuse to just not be together anymore. So you have to be careful to, every once in a while be like, I think we might just have to rehearse that. But it's a fun layer to start working on more and more.
That reminds me of, I just have to, one of my favorite things I ever heard the now late Leon Fleischer say was that he believed that he was, for those of you that don't know who he was an incredible pianist, but he passed away during the pandemic, and I think I heard him at the Marlborough Festival one summer talk about how every note, in his opinion, has a perfect sweet spot in time, like an absolute perfect place for it to sound, and that the greatest musicians get within a couple nanoseconds of those places. But just this idea that there's this absolutely perfect, and like everyone's in search for this like perfection of timing is, I don't know, it's like maybe it's like a hopelessly romantic idea, but it's like so cool to put it in that terminology.
Yeah, I really like that terminology for sure. Something that's not in my questions, but it was something that I always found fascinating in watching ensembles rehearse is the ability that you have to adjust your intervals so that the intervals vary a lot, and especially when you have something tricky, like for the violin to be in tune with the cello, it's very hard to get the viola in there just where you want it. And I wondered if you might sort of describe how you do that, how you, purposely adjust these intervals that they're not perfect, that they're what you're after.
Well, it's a very case-by-case thing. I mean, I think we do have some general guidelines when it comes to intonation, but it's another example of when you're younger, intonation seems much more objective, but it's not really. I mean, there are certain things about it that are, but then when you get to like intricate types of harmonies and also tuning things melodically, then it becomes more subjective. And what are you trying to go for? Which way do you want something to lean or pull, or what kind of, like, do you want the major chord to feel really bright, or do you want it to feel very settled and resonant and kind of earthy and deep? So a lot of the time when we think things don't sound quite in tune, it might be a response to not getting the right emotional response from how we're playing. And sometimes it's just out of tune. And regardless of what's happening, when we slow down and tune it, we usually end up having some kind of discussion about what we like better. And we'll try it different ways and then settle on what seems to be working the best for the group as a whole, which sometimes can go completely against what we thought it was going to. Like, we all think a certain type of intonation is going to work in that section. We try it and it's just not sounding right. And then we change it and we all realize, oh, I guess let's do it that way. That actually worked.
That's the one.
Yeah.
I often tell my students that learning to play in a string quartet really well is like an exercise in being able to play exactly out of tune just how you want to all the time. And it's like, I think it's kind of mind-blowing for them, because like Ilana was saying about it being very objective when you're young, and it's like, that's in tune and that's out of tune. But there's A at 441 and there's A at 339 or 439, and those are very very different in terms of what they mean, and in terms of where they fit into a chord, and depending what the overtones are. It's like it's talking about a whole different ballgame, but they're both correct.
Mm-hmm.
Just how you choose to use them.
So when you're interpreting a work like Beethoven, like you just finished the middle Beethovens and now you're on to the late Beethovens, is there a scholarly aspect to the interpretation of a work? What are you doing in that regard?
That's a great question. I think there often is a scholarly aspect. With Beethoven, he's so often visited and they're such great editions now. There weren't always in the past, but now we do have access to some really good editions from people who have spent their whole lives kind of poring over those details. So it's a little bit of a different process, I guess, recording his music in that sense. But you remind me of a story which I thought was so cool. Again, actually, happens to be David Finkel from the Emerson, former cellist of the Emerson Quartet, who was doing some sleuthing surrounding the manuscript of the Dvorak-Dumke trio, which starts with this famous cello solo, which is very loud and very sustained and all this stuff. And he found that when he looked at the original manuscript, the first 2 pages of the score were actually taped together on the edges, but on the inside, you could look inside and there was an alternate opening. And so he got permission from the library, wherever this was, I don't remember, to look inside and take pictures of it, and they did. And they found this alternate opening with different timings, and the strings were tremolo, like, really fast. There was no sustain, really, but it was like this shimmer. And those kind of things really can inform the way you play the final product. Of course, you also know that the composer then, in that case, abandoned that idea. So, why did they abandon it? But there must have been some sense of relatability and truth about the character that they were considering that as an option. So yeah, it can certainly be true. And I think when we recorded the Schumann, there was quite a bit of research into other aspects of his life, and we consulted some other experts who have played a lot more Schumann than we, because there are only 3 quartets, but he has obviously such a huge amount of music that was helpful. So yeah, it really can depend on the composer, but absolutely there's a lot of sleuthing that goes on.
The next set of questions I'm asking for any of those who are youth in the audience, and the idea of mentors and mentorship, and who, if maybe you talk about one of your mentors and what you learned from them and what you think makes a good mentor, and maybe how it shaped the way you now mentor your students.
I think, well, one person I think of is Pete Wiley, actually, who was Canada's cello teacher. He was one of our coaches. I remember we played a coaching for him. We had a coaching with him. And I was really frustrated with this one little viola solo. I think it was in the Barber Quartet, first movement. And I stopped frustratedly and was like, it just never sounds like how I'm envisioning it in my mind for it to sound. It's just not sounding that way. And I'm trying so hard to get it to sound that way, and it's not happening. And he was like, just stop trying, just have it sound that way. Or he said something very simple like that. And it kind of dawned on me that I was getting in my own way, because I was telling myself psychologically, I was putting all this importance on that part instead of just playing and letting it come out more naturally. And it led me to a thing that I try to do with all of my students, which is to just kind of realize all of the mentors who I've found very, very helpful and really comforting are ones who relate your issues to their own, instead of kind of telling you this thing was easy for me. They're like, oh, that was also hard for me. And meanwhile you're looking up to them there's not any possibility that was ever hard for them. There's everything they do seems easy. And that's what I try to talk to my students about, is we all have the exact same roadblocks and the same kind of psychological, blocks, things that are just you're getting in your own way about. So I find that very, very comforting and helpful in a mentor.
Yeah, I feel like the mental part is actually really huge, and just in terms of performance and trusting yourself and feeling on your game, there's a lot of the psychology that goes into it. It's not a matter of can I myself actually play the things that I feel I'm struggling with. It's a matter of what is my mind telling me I can do. And I know that anytime I've been at a concert when I'm oh, this really hard part is coming up, don't mess it up, or you were struggling with that today, I would say 9 times out of 10 when I've had that mental process, I've then messed that up. And then a lot of times where I'm just oh, have fun with it and relax and be okay and just trust it. It's been fine, more times than not. So it's I feel like what Milana's saying about the psychology behind it, I feel that's something that we don't generally talk about so much. And I feel like today we're becoming much more aware of mental health and emotional health and all that stuff. But I do feel like talking about the thought process is really helpful because we get into these unhealthy spirals. So yeah, for me, it's about, even when someone's like, oh, I'm going to be nervous at this concert, I'm like, well, but think about it from the audience perspective. Like, what are you nervous about? They want to hear you play well. Like, how many people are coming to this concert being like, I want to hear this particular individual really like suck up the court with the way that they're playing this like thing. Like, I just want to see this person fail, right? So it's like, actually, there's one should be sensing that there's a lot of positivity in these spaces. And I think that's something that I'm certainly trying to focus on with anybody that I'm working with at any time, including myself.
So I just got a little notice there that we have 15 minutes left. So I want you to talk about your role at Curtis. And you all joined the faculty there in 2020. And I'm curious about how this might have changed the rhythm of your performing life, the balance between teaching, performing, and recording. And also, this is a big responsibility and a long-term thing. So I'd like to know what you're thinking you would like to see with the chamber program at Curtis long-term. Might be too early to answer that question, but maybe you're already thinking about it.
Yeah, I think we are thinking about those things. I think it's hard in a way for me anyway to answer just how it has affected our balance of activities yet, just because the world is still reeling so much from the changes that COVID has presented to performers. And even in the sense that, for instance, this fall, we've actually been very busy, but busy to a degree that was not the design of our program with Curtis. But we had to do it because we were recouping all these cancellations from the past year and a half. I think the design of the program in general, though, is that in terms of balance, we would probably be at home about half the time, as opposed to 3 to 5 days a month, and teaching more often, obviously. And I do think we'll probably get to that balance, and it's going to be wonderful. We all adore teaching, and we love that school, of course, deeply. And I think there's a lot of exciting possibilities for things that we can do in the chamber music department. But actually, maybe I'll leave that to one of my colleagues to maybe expand on that.
No, I mean, I haven't really thought so much about the future. I feel like there's already such amazing work being done in chamber music at Curtis, and it's always been such a big part of the curriculum. I mean, selfishly, it would be really fun to see a group that wanted to be serious like we were, 13 years ago, come out of there at some point, and maybe we could have something to do with that. But, these things are such, I mean, with the four of us, I mean, we've been through a lot together, and of course, you never really know what's going to happen. I think every quartet kind of gets started with the idea of, we really enjoy this, and this is going to be our future, and we're all in, and life kind of happens. And I think that's always given me a really renewed sense of appreciation for my colleagues, because I think, in the beginning, you never really know how committed people are. And I think everyone at every stage has shown just like such extreme commitment. And that's not something that just happens by being in music. That takes a lot of personal, grit a lot of the time. So, yeah, I mean, without getting too personal about it, it would be really fun to just kind of see people wanting to pursue it on a professional level, and having it being more than just a curriculum offering that I need to fulfill playing in a string quartet or in a quintet to be able to get my diploma and get the hell out of here, kind of thing. So it would be, which is not really that's not at all really the attitude there. But, I feel like there's either the people who are interested in it or the people who aren't, and it would just, kind of be nice to see it kind of flow naturally.
Yeah. I can totally see that, wanting to share the thing that is valuable to you with a group that really appreciates that and wants it also. So you've just finished the second, or I guess you've just released the second volume of your 3-volume Beethoven recording series. When you're doing something like that and you're recording pieces that are sequential in the context of the other pieces around them, does it change the way you feel or understand the works? Like, do you feel differently about the middle string quartets than you did before you started recording them? did you discover something new about them?
Discovered how hard they are. Like how hard they are to make them sound good.
No, but you're always discovering something new about pieces when you're like, even when you revisit a piece after 5 years or something that you worked on really, really hard all year long, and then you didn't play for 5 years, come back to it, you discover new things in it. Even if you listen to a piece twice in a row, you just probably discover something new in it. And recording pieces like the way that we have with the Beethoven, where we're recording every single thing from the earlies all the way through the lates, the context definitely does change the way that you hear the piece and respond to the piece. Pretty much like anything in music, like within a piece, the context of the musical material that you're experiencing in that moment, it affects how that like melody sounds. Like, well, how did you play the thing right before? It's like one of the reasons we have such in-depth discussions in rehearsal. It's like, well, this doesn't feel like that. Well, maybe it's because of what we just said before. So yeah, totally changes the way. I mean, not in a revolutionary way where it feels like a different piece, but where we feel like we get to know the piece a lot better through the process of not only recording, but doing it in that way, like a full cycle.
It's sort of the
sorry.
trajectory of Beethoven's life that follows his thinking.
Yeah, I also feel that with someone like who composed at the level that we all can agree that Beethoven was at, like it is really like endless, the amount of stuff that you find. And it's like like Milana was saying, even if it's like something small that you pick up on, it's just that much more of a like realizing that the dude was like even that much more of a genius than you thought he was already at like the highest level of genius. So it's like it's always very humbling to work, and it's just like it's all throughout, like the level never stopped, like when he was doing it and like trying so many new things. And obviously the 59s are like a whole different thing from the 18s, and it's really cool to get to go through that development with him. I feel like it's very cool.
Yeah, one of the weird things that it made me think of, to be honest, through the process was, recording that many pieces is a multi-year project, obviously, and we all went through lots of changes, some good and some really challenging through that time, and you can still remember how you felt recording certain pieces. And I think that actually just made me think of the composers themselves, not just Beethoven, but it's of course impossible for them to know exactly how they felt during certain times. But whether they were writing music that sounded happy, but they were really struggling, or whether their emotions really lined up with what they were doing musically. But I have a feeling it's probably more complicated than just, this composer wrote this when they were feeling really sad, and here's this really sad piece. I don't think that's really how human life, it's not usually that simple. So I always wonder that now, listening to music that's very emotionally clear, really whether that's what they were feeling or whether it was a much more rich, textured soup of stuff that was going on in their world at that moment.
Now I think I probably have. I have about 7 minutes. I'm going to end my questions and then open it up to everyone, but I'm going to end my questions with a philosophical question. What do you think the role of an artist is in the world today? I mean, is that something you even think about? Do you have certain ideas about what you want to be as an artist citizen? We'll start with you, Camden, since you're already front and center.
Oh, I was just going to text somebody and be like, you take this one. I don't know. There are so many responsibilities of artists of all disciplines, I suppose. I think amongst those responsibilities are to be the best version of yourself. So I guess being true to yourself in whatever your art form is, that's probably where you're going to have the most impact anyway, is by being honest with yourself and about yourself. I suppose making sure that your art is actually reaching people in a positive way. I mean, if you're designing art that's causing people pain, you might question, at least I might question whether that's really a good thing. I guess specifically in the music for us, in the music world, we're weighing very consciously responsibilities of whose music we play, because there are so many people who deserve to be heard. So I think that's a realm that in which there's a lot of discussion weighing, there people are young and composing now who need to be heard, people who are alive but older and maybe not in the limelight right now, not young and exciting and deserve to be heard. Certainly people of the past who were, subjugated, people of now who are subjugated. There's a lot to weigh. But I think that is something that we talk about a lot now because ultimately that has a lot of impact as well. It's just who you decide to work on and appeal to.
So we have 5 minutes left. I want to give those of you who are in the audience a chance to ask questions. Sarah, can you unmute and help them turn on their cameras, or would you rather have them type things in?
I can ask people to unmute, but you do have a question in the chat.
I see that. The question is that, you're players and not composers, but have you tried your hand at composing?
I did when I was young, and it was horrible. So it didn't relate anything to my playing. It just made me appreciate playing more and appreciate composers more.
Mm-hmm. In some ensembles, it's helpful to have a member who can do arrangements. I don't know if any of you do arranging. No.
We haven't really. I mean, I also, like Joel, I tried writing music a lot I loved writing music on the piano when I was little. And then when I was in middle school or elementary school, I wrote a piece for my school orchestra. And then in high school, I arranged a piece for the band and conducted it. And that was when I decided I would neither be a conductor nor a composer.
The harsh reality, but when it comes in real strong.
Well, I give people just a little bit more time. We have 4 minutes. If not, we might end now. I want to thank you all. This has been a really, really good discussion. I think that you talked more deeply about the process of thinking and making music than any group we've had on, and I really appreciate you're willing to go there with me.
Those were great questions. Yeah.
Really good question.
Thanks.
Really fun to unpack.
So I hope those of you who are here listening in today will join us to see them live on Saturday. It's going to be a great treat to have them at PH Hall, and so thank you all for attending, and I wish you a good night.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
them. I kind of did. I have a question, Sarah. So will these be uploaded